Close your eyes and drift back to ancient Macedonia, 336 BCE. A 20-year-old prince stands over his father's murdered body, hands already red with the blood that will soon flood 3 continents. You've heard the legend of Alexander the Great, brilliant strategist, fearless conqueror, son of gods. But tonight, we peel back the myth to expose a far darker reality. These weren't noble campaigns. They were brutal exterminations. Entire civilizations reduced to smoke, millions dead, and the soldiers who survived, shattered men, cursed to relive what they had done. This isn't a story of glory. It's a story of burning cities and civilians crucified along shorelines, of warriors forced to march through death-soaked deserts, their bodies decaying, their minds unraveling. This is the descent of a young king, once brilliant, now obsessed with immortal fame, who slowly became a paranoid tyrant, murdering his closest allies and dying alone, feared even in death. Welcome to Ancient Mysteries for Sleep, where we reveal the truths history tried to forget. I'll be your guide through the shadowed corridors of the Macedonian war machine, where the price of victory makes modern war seem merciful. We'll relive the siege of Tyre, one of the bloodiest in ancient memory. We'll see how the Persian Empire fell not by strategy, but through calculated terror, and we'll follow the psychological collapse of Alexander's army. Men once proud, now broken by what they witnessed and what they became. But the most disturbing transformation, Alexander himself, from visionary leader to paranoid god-king, devoured by his own ambition and cruelty. So lie back, let your mind slip into the past, and prepare to witness the nightmare hidden behind one of history's greatest legends. Spring 332 BCE. Alexander the Great stands on the shores of the Mediterranean, staring across the water at the island city of Tyre. What he's about to unleash will become one of the most brutal and haunting sieges in ancient history. A 7-month descent into horror that would change both the conqueror and the conquered forever. Tyre was no ordinary city. For over 1,000 years, it had dominated Mediterranean trade. Its merchants sailed to every known corner of the world. Its purple dye clothed emperors. Its craftsmen created treasures that adorned the grandest palaces. Built on an island half a mile from shore, it was an engineering marvel. Its massive walls rising over 150 feet from the sea, defended by elite military engineers and centuries of unbroken pride. When Alexander sent a messenger demanding the city's submission, the Tyrians responded without hesitation. They had survived sieges before. They had seen empires rise and fall. Their gods, Melkart and Astarte, had protected them for generations. Their walls had never fallen. Their spirit had never broken. They believed Alexander would be no different. What they didn't understand was that they weren't dealing with a typical commander. Alexander wasn't just tactically brilliant, he was also increasingly unstable. This wasn't just war, it was personal, a challenge to his divine destiny, a test he intended to crush with overwhelming force. His plan was audacious, insane, some thought. He would build a causeway across the sea, stone and timber dragged from the mainland to connect to the island, allowing his siege towers and catapults to reach Tyre's impregnable walls. What began as an engineering marvel quickly turned into something much darker, a road paved with the bones of the enslaved and the conquered. To build it, Alexander's forces tore apart nearby towns. Temples, homes, and marketplaces were stripped for stone and timber. Entire Phoenician settlements, some hundreds of years old, were reduced to rubble within days, their people scattered or enslaved, their history destroyed to satisfy one man's obsession. But materials weren't enough. He needed labor. Thousands of workers, captured men, women, and children, were forced into the sea, carrying stones heavier than their bodies, building a path toward their own doom. Under constant fire from Tyrian archers, in water up to their chests, they died by the hundreds, from exhaustion, from disease, from wounds. Many fell where they stood, their bodies incorporated into the foundation. Desperate, the Tyrians struck back. They launched fire ships at the wooden sections of the causeway, hoping to ignite it before it reached their walls. Their archers targeted the workers at the waterline. Diplomats offered gold, trade, anything but unconditional surrender. But Alexander had long since passed the point of negotiation. This was no longer about military objectives. This was a divine test of will. Each attack by Tyre only deepened his resolve. The city would not just be defeated, it would be made an example, one so terrifying that other cities would fall without a fight. As the summer wore on, the causeway became a death zone. Workers, often waist-deep in water, endured constant attacks, starvation, and disease. They died by the hundreds, their suffering mostly unrecorded, their names forgotten. But archaeology remembers them. Bones embedded in the stones, human remains fused with mortar and rubble, a road built from flesh and blood. Those who survived would never forget what they saw. Stones splashing into water already red with blood. Wounded workers screaming as sea creatures attacked them. Flaming ships bearing down in the night, the flames reflected across the waves, and the causeway kept growing. By winter, it was finished, but the nightmare was just beginning. Alexander unveiled siege towers unlike anything the world had seen. Massive, iron-plated structures, nearly 200 feet tall, mounted with catapults and archers. They weren't just engines of war, they were instruments of terror, designed to crush defenses and the will to resist. He deployed psychological warfare with chilling creativity. Giant mirrors reflected sunlight into the defenders' eyes. Drums thundered for days on end to deny Tyrians sleep. It wasn't just about breaching walls, it was about breaking minds. But nothing compared to the horrors along the coast. Alexander ordered captured Tyrians crucified along the shoreline, visible from the city's walls. Their screams echoed across the water for days. Refugees who tried to flee were hunted down, tortured, and executed where their families could see them. After 7 months of siege, both sides had been transformed. Tyre's citizens, once merchants, scholars, and craftsmen, were now desperate defenders. Children fought beside elders. Women turned jewelry into arrowheads. The elderly volunteered for suicide missions. It was total war. Alexander's men had changed too. The once disciplined Macedonian soldiers had become desensitized and savage. They competed to invent new tortures for prisoners. They placed bets on how long the crucified would last. They collected ears and fingers as trophies. At dawn, late in summer, the final assault began. Alexander's siege towers rolled across the completed causeway. His navy attacked the harbor. For the first time in over 1,000 years, the walls of Tyre began to collapse. Still, the Tyrians resisted. Street by street, house by house, they fought. Shops and homes became fortresses. Women and children used whatever they could as weapons. Blood flowed through the narrow alleys as Macedonian troops showed no mercy. After 3 days of fighting, resistance collapsed. The massacre that followed was catastrophic, even by ancient standards. Over 30,000 Tyrians were slaughtered. Another 30,000 were enslaved. The city was reduced to ashes. Its ancient temples and libraries, repositories of Phoenician knowledge and science, were consumed by fire. Alexander wasn't finished. He ordered 2,000 surviving soldiers crucified along the coast. Slowly, publicly, personally attending many of the executions to ensure word of his wrath spread across the ancient world. But the most devastating loss was not the bodies, it was the knowledge. Tyre's libraries held centuries of history, astronomy, mathematics, entire languages, philosophies, and traditions, gone in a single blaze of ambition. Today, that causeway still exists. Though buried under centuries of silt and modern development, archaeologists have uncovered the remains, stones fused with human bones, the lingering evidence of thousands sacrificed to build a road across the sea. As we drift deeper into this story, remember, Tyre was only the beginning. This was just the rehearsal. From the ruins of that great city, a new Alexander emerged. No longer just a conqueror, but a man who had tasted the power of divine cruelty. And he would never be the same again. From the ashes of Tyre, Alexander turned east, toward the greatest prize the ancient world had ever known, the Persian Empire. But what followed wasn't just a military conquest. It was the deliberate erasure of a civilization. Persia wasn't defeated, it was extinguished, systematically, brutally, irrevocably. The Persian Empire that Alexander invaded in 334 BCE wasn't just vast, it was visionary. Stretching from the Indus to the Aegean, it ruled over dozens of cultures. But unlike other empires, it didn't crush diversity, it embraced it. Persian kings ruled not by iron fist, but by strategic tolerance. They collected tribute but preserved local customs, protected regional religions, and respected the ancient laws and languages of their people. This policy of inclusion created one of the most prosperous eras in human history. Trade flourished along safe, guarded routes. Cities stopped competing and started specializing. Knowledge flowed freely. Science from India, astronomy from Babylon, philosophy from Egypt and Greece. It was a golden web connecting the ancient world. At its heart stood Persepolis, the ceremonial capital built by Darius the Great. Here, tribute from across 3 continents poured into royal halls carved with visions of peace, not war. Ivory from Africa, spices from India, gold from Scythia, stones from Afghanistan, a cathedral of cultures ruled by the King of Kings. But Persepolis was more than grandeur. Its reliefs didn't depict war, they depicted unity. Peoples from every region came bearing gifts, not under duress, but as respected subjects of a tolerant empire. The architecture blended Egyptian, Babylonian, Greek, and Persian styles, a harmony in stone that mirrored the society itself. When Alexander crossed the Hellespont, he wasn't just invading territory, he was attacking an idea. The commanders who met him didn't fight for thrones. They fought for a way of life, one that had created peace in a world addicted to conflict. The first confrontation at the Granicus River set a grim precedent. Outnumbered, Alexander's tactics overwhelmed the Persians. But the real terror came after the battle. Persian nobles who had surrendered or been captured weren't spared. They were executed, not as soldiers, but as symbols. Satraps who had ruled justly for decades were crucified. Priests were murdered inside their temples, their sacred fires extinguished. Scholars, guardians of ancient texts, were tortured for gold, then killed so their knowledge would die with them. This wasn't war, this was extermination. Alexander didn't want to rule Persia, he wanted to erase it. At Miletus, defenders who surrendered under promise of safety were sold into slavery. At Halicarnassus, civilians were butchered. With each new city, Alexander grew more merciless. Resistance wasn't crushed, it was punished ritualistically. Even his own soldiers began to feel it. Macedonian veterans had expected to fight warriors. Instead, they were ordered to slaughter civilians. Greek allies who joined to liberate Asia were horrified to find themselves burning cities more advanced than their own. Parmenion, Alexander's seasoned general, pleaded for moderation, but the young king was no longer listening. This was personal. The siege of Tyre had shown him the power of terror. He would use it to make the world kneel, and it worked. Cities that once might have resisted laid down their weapons in fear. But surrender didn't guarantee survival. Administrators were executed, merchants enslaved, families robbed of everything. Even those who welcomed Alexander were destroyed. To send a message, Anatolia became a graveyard. Cities that had stood for millennia were annihilated in hours. Libraries burned, temples leveled, languages spoken for centuries snuffed out with the deaths of their last speakers. At Sardis, once a beacon of knowledge, the destruction was total. Homes were ripped apart, temples desecrated, bodies littered the streets. What wasn't stolen was destroyed. What couldn't be taken was erased. And still the army marched on. The road to Gordium passed through some of the richest land in Persia, an agricultural marvel powered by ancient irrigation and careful stewardship. But Alexander's army, bloated with soldiers and camp followers, moved like a plague. Fields were stripped bare, forests cut down, waterworks ruined, entire communities vanished. The empire's infrastructure, its lifeblood, was severed. And then came the knot. In the palace of Gordium stood a chariot bound by a complex knot. Legend said that whoever unraveled it would rule all of Asia. Alexander didn't hesitate. He drew his sword and cut through it. To his followers, it was a sign of divine destiny. But it revealed something else, a refusal to understand what could simply be destroyed. From Gordium, Alexander marched towards Syria, the Persian heartland. These regions had enjoyed peace for centuries. Trade had enriched cities, culture had flourished. Now that civilization watched helplessly as it was unmade. In 333 BCE, Alexander faced Darius III at Issus. The Persian army was vast, the largest ever assembled. But Alexander, using tactics learned from his father, shattered it. Darius fled, leaving behind his army, his royal tent, and his family. The symbolism was devastating. The King of Kings abandoning wife, children, and crown, humiliated by a Macedonian prince. But the horror came after. The Persian camp was filled with treasures, manuscripts, scrolls, artworks, artifacts, all burned or looted. Priceless knowledge turned into campfire fuel, tapestries used as bedding, gold and silver melted into coin. Prisoners were worse off. Nobles were tortured and killed, soldiers enslaved, civilians massacred. Darius's wife and mother were paraded like trophies. His children, once heirs to a mighty empire, now lived under the boots of drunken soldiers. And then there was Bagoas, the royal treasurer, custodian of Persia's economy, held the keys to a system that had kept the empire running for centuries. Under torture, he revealed everything: tribute routes, storage caches, trade links. And once his knowledge had been extracted, he was killed in front of his peers, slowly, as a warning. It wasn't just his life that ended. It was an entire way of understanding the world. His death was the death of Persian memory. Issus should have ended the war. But for Alexander, it only fueled his transformation. The boy who claimed to free Asia now ruled it like a god-king. His ambition no longer had borders. His conscience no longer had limits. As his army pressed deeper into Persia, the destruction would only grow. Cities that had never seen war would fall into silence. Peoples who had lived in peace for generations would vanish. And Alexander? He had learned something terrible, that fear could be more powerful than love, more permanent than legacy, that to become immortal, you didn't need to build empires. You just had to burn them down. Behind every legendary conqueror stands an army, and behind every story of glory lies a harsher truth, what those soldiers endured. Alexander's campaigns weren't just a nightmare for the conquered. They were a living hell for his own men, who marched alongside him for over a decade, only to emerge as shattered remnants of who they once were. When they crossed the Hellespont in 334 BCE, Alexander's army was the pride of the ancient world. These were not amateurs, they were professional warriors, trained from youth under Philip II's revolutionary military system. Disciplined, fearless, and loyal. Most expected the campaign to last a few years. Glory, riches, and then home. But nothing could have prepared them for what was to come. A war that was supposed to take 3 years would stretch into 13. A mission to defeat Persia would become a brutal odyssey to the edge of the known world. They wouldn't just fight battles, they'd bury friends lost to disease, exhaustion, madness, and the unbearable cost of watching humanity vanish before their eyes. The first crack in their expectations came early, at Halicarnassus. Its Persian defenses were unlike anything they'd faced. What should have been a swift siege turned into weeks of carnage. Soldiers died by the hundreds, crushed by stones, pierced by enemy arrows, burned alive by fire traps. Those who survived Halicarnassus were changed. They'd seen what it meant to charge into walls too high to scale, to stumble over the corpses of friends, to be ordered forward again and again, no matter the losses. But worse than the danger was what came next. After the city fell, they weren't ordered to rebuild or guard. They were ordered to destroy. Civilians were massacred, women and children enslaved, libraries torched, temples leveled. Not for military gain, but for spectacle. For many, this broke something inside. These were men who had been raised with codes of honor. Warfare, yes, but against armed opponents. Not this, not the slaughter of innocents. Some hesitated, some resisted. And though the official histories say little, scattered records hint at growing dissent. Alexander's tolerance for questioning was already fading. Disobedience was flogged, at first with 5 lashes, then 10, then 50. By the time the army reached India, men were being whipped to death for voicing doubts. From Halicarnassus to Tyre, the terrain was punishing. Narrow mountain passes, searing deserts, ambushes at river crossings. Each day, new dangers. But even the harshest landscape paled beside the darkness growing in Alexander. He changed. Cities that welcomed him were pillaged as ruthlessly as those that resisted. The rules of war were thrown aside. Terror became policy. For his soldiers, the psychological toll deepened. What did honor mean when their leader ordered the execution of unarmed prisoners? When mercy was punished and cruelty rewarded? Some adapted by becoming monsters. They competed in cruelty, invented new tortures, collected body parts as trophies. Others went numb, performing their duties like machines, haunted by what they'd become. Then came Tyre. The siege dragged on for 7 months. The construction of the causeway demanded endless labor. Slaves died by the thousands. Exhaustion, drowning, disease. And Alexander's soldiers, the same men who once tilled soil or carved wood, were ordered to supervise the death. Many couldn't handle it. They drank to forget, clung to superstitions, whispered prayers at night for forgiveness. Some secretly helped the workers, sharing rations, offering rest. But those mercies only made things worse when they had to turn around and kill the same people they just comforted. The contradiction tore at them, and still, the causeway crawled forward, fed by lives. When Tyre finally fell, the dam broke. The rage, the grief, the madness, everything spilled out. 3 days of slaughter, children thrown from walls, women murdered in the streets, elders tortured for amusement, ancient temples burned. Many would never recover. Later they called it mass insanity, a frenzy, but it was deeper than that. They had become something they didn't recognize. After Tyre, the march to Egypt should have brought relief. Cities surrendered without a fight, but even surrender didn't save them. Populations were still enslaved, homes still looted, and the soldiers knew this wasn't war anymore. It was theater for Alexander's ego. Egypt offered a brief pause. The people welcomed Alexander. His soldiers tried to believe in the lie, that they were liberators, but deep down they knew it wouldn't last. Then came Gaugamela. The Persians assembled their largest army yet, a final stand, a real battle, and Alexander triumphed through sheer tactical brilliance. Darius fled. The Persian Empire was broken, but again the aftermath shattered morale. The Persian camp was looted, priceless manuscripts burned, tapestries defiled. Alexander ordered captured nobles executed. Soldiers who'd fought with honor were slaughtered for convenience. Even the bravest warriors were treated like animals. The soldiers, who once believed in military glory, now questioned if it meant anything at all. From Gaugamela, they marched to Persepolis. The city stood as Persia's heart, a masterpiece of civilization. It was untouched, surrendered without resistance. Alexander burned it. It wasn't strategy, it was insecurity. Persepolis represented greatness outside of Alexander's shadow, and he couldn't bear it. His men, once builders, became destroyers. They smashed what they couldn't understand, tore down what they couldn't equal. For many, it was the breaking point. They had nothing left but pain, guilt, and fear. Then came Bactria, Sogdiana. The war shifted. No more pitched battles, just endless raids. Villages burned, tribes hunted, people exterminated simply for existing on land Alexander wanted. The army unraveled, discipline vanished, soldiers deserted, officers refused to lead atrocities. And Alexander? He tightened his grip. More floggings, more executions, more silence. By the time they reached India, the army was unrecognizable. The mutiny at the Hyphasis River wasn't just rebellion, it was a cry for humanity. They were done. They had nothing left to give. Alexander backed down, not out of compassion, but because he had to. The dream of conquest would continue, but his men were ghosts of their former selves. Even on the retreat, his rage flared. Cities burned, allies punished, innocents slaughtered. When the army returned to Babylon, only half remained, and of those, many were dead inside, haunted, hollow, marked by memories that would never fade. These were the true victims, not just the conquered, but the conquerors, soldiers who left home for glory and returned with nightmares, men who thought they were heroes, only to discover they'd become tools of destruction. So the next time history celebrates a military triumph, remember what it cost. Not just in lives lost, but in souls destroyed. Power corrupts, they say. But absolute power, the kind that commands life and death, that bends nations and history itself, does something far worse. It doesn't just corrupt, it unravels the soul. By 330 BCE, Alexander the Great was no longer just a king or conqueror. He had become something else entirely, a force of destruction, consumed by obsessions growing darker and more grandiose with every passing year. His descent didn't happen overnight. In his youth, Alexander embodied everything greatness required: intelligence, courage, charisma. He inspired loyalty, even love. Early in his campaigns, flickers of that humanity remained. He could show mercy, he could take counsel, he could still see the people behind the cities he destroyed. But absolute power poisoned slowly. Each victory chipped away at his restraint. Each atrocity taught him a terrible lesson: that there were no limits, that suffering had no consequence if it served his glory, that reality could be bent to his will and broken to prove it. Tyre was the turning point, not just for the world, but for Alexander. The siege taught him that he could inflict unlimited pain and face no judgment. That horror could be a tool, that nothing was sacred, but even that wasn't enough. Conquering Tyre should have satisfied him. It didn't. The executions, the cultural annihilation, the spectacle, it was no longer about military victory. It was about feeding something deeper, something hungrier. As his army advanced through Persia, cities surrendered without a fight, terrified by his reputation. Any other general would have welcomed this, not Alexander. Peace denied him the chance to prove himself through suffering. And so, cities that welcomed him were punished just as severely as those that resisted. It became obvious to anyone who dared to look. This was no longer about strategy. The campaign had become a ritual of domination. Each act of violence was a declaration that he alone mattered, that only his will deserved to exist. When Darius III was killed, not by Alexander, but by his own men, it should have ended the war. Instead, Alexander exploded. His greatest rival had died without giving him the satisfaction of defeating him personally. He mourned not Darius, but the moment stolen from him. His grief became obsession. The satraps who killed Darius were hunted down and executed, not for treason, but for denying Alexander his performance, the spectacle he craved. From this moment on, his rage turned inward. No longer just enemies, his own men became targets. Friends, counselors, officers, anyone who threatened his fantasies of control. The adoption of Persian customs, once defended as a political strategy, revealed his detachment. Requiring his Macedonian officers to prostrate themselves before him wasn't diplomacy, it was delusion. It was the need to be worshipped. Veterans who had fought beside him for over a decade now had to crawl before him, not as soldiers, but as subjects. Their humiliation became a theater of obedience, and many broke under its weight. Some refused. Conspiracies formed, not out of politics, but desperation. Men who still clung to reality saw what their king had become, and they were terrified. Parmenion was the first to fall. Loyal since the days of Philip, victorious in countless battles, a voice of reason, but he questioned too often. He reminded Alexander of limits, of consequence, and that had become intolerable. Parmenion was assassinated without warning, stabbed while reading a letter, never understanding why he was killed. A man who had once saved the empire, discarded like an inconvenience. This sent a message. No one was safe. Not even the old guard. Not even those who had built Alexander's legend. As fear replaced loyalty, Alexander drifted into isolation. Surrounded by flatterers and opportunists, he heard only what he wanted. The feedback loop was broken. Reality was no longer allowed in the room. The Central Asian campaigns made that clear. There was no strategic reason to fight in Bactria or Sogdiana. No threats, no resources. These wars existed solely because Alexander could not tolerate the idea that any people might resist him. He raised entire populations, not because they rebelled, but because they existed outside his reach. The brutality escalated, and with it, his distance from reality. The marriage to Roxana, praised as a union of East and West, was no romance. It was conquest in ceremonial form. Her father was dead, her people enslaved. The wedding was not a celebration, it was domination, dressed in silk. Roxana was not a queen, she was a symbol, a possession, a tool to declare, even the future belongs to me. And then there was Clitus, the man who had saved Alexander's life at Granicus, a brother in arms, a voice of reason. Clitus dared to speak truth about Alexander's abandonment of Macedonian values, about the price his army had paid. Alexander killed him with his own hand, a drunken rage, a moment of horrifying clarity. His self-control was gone, his humanity slipping fast. For a brief time, he mourned, refused to eat, isolated himself, but soon his grief twisted into justification. Clitus had deserved it. Clitus had challenged destiny, and destiny could not be questioned. His ambitions swelled beyond reality. He spoke of conquering Arabia, circumnavigating Africa, building cities greater than any before. Fantasies detached from logistics, from politics, from reason. The mass weddings at Susa, Macedonian officers forced to marry Persian noblewomen, were not about unity. They were about control. Bodies turned into symbols, lives twisted into policy. Alexander's final days in Babylon were consumed by these dreams, fantasies of total empire, plans for campaigns that would never happen. While the world around him began to crumble, rebellions stirred, governors stopped listening. The machinery of empire groaned under his obsession, but Alexander didn't see it. He no longer saw anything but his vision. He ignored his body, drank heavily, refused treatment, forced himself into ceremonies when he could barely stand. The god he had become couldn't afford to show weakness. And then, fever took him. In 323 BCE, at just 32 years old, Alexander died, not as a god, not as a king, but as a man consumed by the monster he had created in himself. His empire fractured immediately. His generals turned on each other. The dream he had sacrificed everything to build disintegrated before his body was cold. The tragedy of Alexander is not just his destruction of others, it's the destruction of himself. The brilliance that once inspired millions had collapsed into delusion. His legacy is not just cities and battles, but a warning, because this is what happens when power is unchecked, when one man believes he is more than human, when glory is chased at the cost of everything else. As we approach the end of our journey, remember, history often forgets the minds behind the monuments. But in the silence beneath the stones, the truth remains. In the spring of 323 BCE, Alexander finally returned to Babylon for the last time. This was no triumphant capital. It was a cage. Babylon had become a city gripped by terror, its people tiptoeing through fear, its officials scrambling to avoid being noticed by a ruler as unpredictable as he was powerful. The man who entered Babylon was a shell of the golden-haired prince who crossed the Hellespont 13 years before. Worn by war, by endless wine, and by the isolation of his own making, he had become unrecognizable, even to those who had once called him friend. His genius remained, but now it bent toward madness. The leader who once inspired fanatical loyalty now glanced at every look, every pause, as betrayal. Babylonians lived in silenced fear. Shops closed before dusk. Artisans hid their work. Children stopped laughing. Even breathing felt dangerous. The machinery of empire had collapsed. Governors sent silk-coated lies to protect themselves. Generals operated on autopilot to avoid new disasters. Alexander, hearing only praise, became further removed from reality. In his final months, he gazed at distant lands, not for conquest, but for affirmation of his divinity. Arabia, the Western Mediterranean, new imperial cities, none of it could be logically supplied. Ambassadors who dared mention logistics vanished. Engineers who spoke of feasibility were silenced. He even remade Babylon to worship him. Priests rewritten prayers. Temples once harboring compassion now exuded intimidation. Traditional hymns were replaced with hymns praising Alexander's divinity. Those priests who resisted were tortured, or worse, Behind closed doors, his closest companions became symbols, not people. Roxana, his teenage bride, was a trophy of conquest, monitored and maneuvered for dynastic ends. Their unborn child was not a legacy of love, but another chess piece in a collapsing empire. Hephaestion, his oldest friend, had become something more, until grief consumed Alexander's sanity. When Hephaestion died in 324 BCE, the king refused to leave his side. His funeral was an orgy of madness, pyres built with sacrificial prisoners, temples erected in his honor, vows sworn before fearful crowds. That lonely vigil fractured Alexander entirely. His final months passed in chaos. Court days devolved into volatile scenes. Commands changed on whims. Meetings became trials. His generals followed orders out of fear, not duty. Conversations became exercises in survival. As his revelries darkened, the final delusions took shape. He spoke of conquering lands beyond the known world, of founding cities on every shore. No plans, no logic, just a god rising in delirium. When his body finally broke in late May, fever, not conquest, claimed him. Refusing medicine, he insisted on ceremonies even as he could barely stand. His final words, the strongest, encapsulated everything he had become. Torn from compassion, tethered only to dominance. In his last lucid moments, he confessed to ghosts, those he'd slaughtered, friends betrayed, cities burned. The empire that had consumed his life crumbled before he was cold. Generals turned on one another. The world he had built shattered. Alexander's tragedy isn't that he fell short, but that he fell so entirely, not destroyed by enemies, but by his own relentless hunger for control. History remembers conquest, but his real legacy is terror. Terror that devours not just others, but the soul of the conqueror himself. As we reach the end of our journey into the dark truths behind Alexander's conquests, we're left not only with a portrait of one man's descent into madness, but with a broader warning about power and what it does to those who wield it, and to those crushed beneath it. This isn't the Alexander you'll find in textbooks or movie epics. The version celebrated through history, the brilliant general, the charismatic visionary, the unifier of East and West, is a carefully curated myth. Behind that legend lies a far more disturbing reality of systematic terror, cultural destruction, and psychological collapse. But this story isn't just about tearing down a legend. It's about understanding how power really works, how it can twist noble intentions into nightmares, how it breaks not only the people ruled by it, but the rulers themselves. The young Alexander who became king in 336 BCE did have greatness in him. He was intelligent, brave, magnetic. His military mind reshaped history, and his vision of merging cultures, Greek and barbarian, held immense potential. But that potential died slowly and painfully. With each victory, Alexander drifted further from moral clarity. Every atrocity, every unpunished cruelty chipped away at his humanity until nothing was left but ego and obsession. The change didn't come all at once. There was no single moment when the hero became the villain. Instead, there was a slow, relentless erosion, justified by fear, pride, ambition. The siege of Tyre awakened something monstrous in him. The burning of Persepolis showed that annihilation satisfied him more than strategy. And the murder of Clitus, his friend, proved that love had no protection in a world ruled by paranoia. By the time he reached Babylon, Alexander wasn't a leader. He was a ghost of himself, disconnected from compassion, detached from truth, capable of anything, and answerable to no one. But this isn't just his story. It's a pattern we've seen throughout history. The liberator who becomes a tyrant, the reformer who builds a machine of oppression, the visionary who forgets what they were trying to build. It's not a flaw in Alexander. It's a flaw in power itself. And his soldiers, they weren't monsters either. They were men, ordinary, loyal, often idealistic, forced to carry out atrocities they never could have imagined when they first marched under his banner. Some gave in to cruelty, others dissociated, just trying to survive. But all of them bore scars, psychological wounds that would never fully heal. And then there were the victims, cities, cultures, entire civilizations, the Phoenician traders, the Persian scholars, the diverse languages and traditions obliterated to make room for one man's dream of Greek supremacy. These weren't just military losses, they were cultural extinctions. What Alexander built couldn't survive him. It collapsed almost immediately. The wars of succession devoured his empire. The systems he created shattered. His name lived on, but the world he tried to shape unraveled before the body was cold. Yet his psychological legacy lived much longer. His trauma-ridden soldiers brought brutality back to Macedonia. His terrorized populations carried grief and resentment for generations. And his methods, systematic terror, the erasure of identity, became a blueprint for future tyrants. Alexander's story isn't ancient history, it's a mirror. The way power corrupts, the excuses we make for cruelty, the seduction of control, the silencing of dissent, the transformation of noble goals into brutal realities. His life reminds us why we need limits on power, why democracy matters, why no one, no matter how brilliant or inspired, should be beyond question. Without accountability, ambition becomes tyranny. Without humility, vision turns into delusion. Alexander studied ethics under Aristotle. He had the tools to do better, but he didn't use them. He chose power over principle, glory over humanity. And once he told himself the rules no longer applied to him, there was no one left to stop what he became. And that's the lesson. It's not about condemning greatness. It's about understanding how easily it collapses into horror when unmoored from conscience. This is why we remember, not to glorify, but to warn. As we close this chapter of human history, let us not forget, even the darkest stories can teach us how to build a better future. We study men like Alexander not to celebrate them, but to ensure we never repeat them. So rest now, fellow travelers through time. Dream not of conquest and crowns, but of compassion, justice, and the courage to resist those who would lead us down darker paths. Let history be not just a record, but a guide.